And then you can take lots of pictures, because there's some nice bits and pieces here all together.
Yeah.
Do you want to sit down?
Okay, yeah.
Right, I was telling you outside that it's not John Robinson, it's Richard Clifton, who's the spiritual head of these separatists. And that begins here because in 1586 you have Richard Clifton becoming the minister here. James Brewster is not around when Clifton comes. So when we go to Scooby, I will tell you where James Brewster was. But once he arrives back in the area in 1588, he is very quickly drawn in by Richard Clifton here. Richard Clifton is a brilliant preacher. And this, as I said, is what's missing from the services in England. Now, do you know where we get Puritan from and separatists, Sal? No. No? Well, we really need to go back to Henry VIII's reign. And that's when all of this problem begins, because our separatists, it's not an overnight sensation with them, it's the result of a long, slow burn. Henry broke with Rome, and before he broke with Rome, all of England was Catholic, yeah? Mm-hmm. There was no other religion in England. On the continent, there were some heretics called Protestants. They were on the continent. England was Catholic, no Protestants in England, while Henry is still within the Catholic Church. Wrong. There were Protestants in England, and they were mainly in London, because there were many mercers, and mercers are the high-class merchants, the elite in London. They have contacts on the continent, and they become, many of them, converted to Protestantism. They daren't let anyone know, because of course it's heresy and you would be executed. And in Henry's reign, we have, for the first time, Bibles printed in English being smuggled into England. When we go to Gainsborough Hall later, we'll be in the home of Lady Rose Hickman. Her father was one of these Bible smugglers. The problem with having the Bible in English is, of course, once you can read the Bible for yourself, and this was a new thing, because in England the Bibles were in Latin. Most people were peasants, didn't speak Latin, and the Bibles were kept in the church. You didn't have access to what was in them. In fact, if you were an ordinary person, you would have what was handed to you by your priest, and you would take that as being the truth. Once you had the Bible in English, of course, people are asking, where are the bishops in the Bible? Where are the bishops living in their palaces, getting rich, while their parishioners starve each winter? Because in England, each winter, the poor in the land would have malnutrition. They would starve, literally starve. Bishops lived in palaces. Where was the signing of the cross at baptism in the Bible? It's not. Where was the wearing of all the garments and the hat? Christ didn't wear garments to keep him separate from his flock. He was an ordinary man, and he certainly didn't hoard up riches for himself. All of this brought a lot of angst, and so there were folk that wanted to reform the church in England, who wanted to have a simplified church akin to what was happening on the continent. Well, Henry did break with Rome, and once he had, we became Protestant in name, but we certainly weren't Protestant by nature. All that happened was the church remained very much Catholic in nature. It's just that the monarch became the head of the church in England. In Edward's reign, that changed, because Edward and his advisors were very Protestant. And in England, a lot of the churches were reformed. In fact, there was a church near where I grew up as a child, and they took down the communion rail, removed the altar, and instead brought a table to the middle of the church where everyone could take communion together. This was extremely radical. And had Edward lived, this Reformed Church would have meant that all of the trouble that would happen for the rest of the Tudor period would have been averted. If the church had been reformed, then happy days. Unfortunately, Edward dies, and there's some people say that he was poisoned.
Oh.
Yes, the Mercers in London had their own undertakers, and there was quite a delay between Edward dying and his funeral being conducted, because we had the uprising with Lady Jane Grey, and then we had Mary coming in and having to fight to get the throne.
The mother of Edward is Anne Boleyn, but
No, the mother of Edward was Jane Seymour.
Jane Seymour.
She's the one who died shortly after he was born.
and Catherine, the mother of Mary. Right?
Yes, Catherine of Aragon was the mother of Mary.
Oh.
So, of course, Mary was very
So
Catholic.
Catherine came from Spain.
Yeah,
Okay.
from Spain. So, anyway, the undertakers say, looking at his organs, there were signs that there was poisoning. Mary comes to England, to the throne in England, and that is when there is real turmoil, because all of these folk who, under Edward's reign especially, had come out as forward evangelical Protestants and wanted to stay that way, were suddenly declared heretics. And you had very few choices, you know. When Mary came to the throne, coming to church was compulsory, and they would write your name down, and if you weren't there, they would know, and they would drag you out of your house to ask you why you weren't at church. And if you refused to conform to the Catholic faith, you'd be burnt as a heretic. Awful, isn't it? Imagine the thought of being burnt for wanting to carry on with your Protestant faith. Many people would either get out of the country if they could. Not everybody had the means to get out of England. Many conformed outwardly by pretending to be Catholic just to save their lives and their families and all of that persecution, and maybe carried on their Protestant religion in quiet. That was dangerous. And also, how can you do that if you're truly Protestant? How can you be Protestant in your heart and then take yourself into a church for the Catholic Mass that would cause terrible internal turmoil? I don't think I could do that. So, execution, conform or pretend to conform, or escape the country. Many folk escaped the country. Many of the merchants escaped. And where we're going later, at Gainsborough Old Hall, Lady Rose Hickman was one of those who, as a young mother with young children, escaped the country because her family were Mercers and they had the ships. And in fact, there are two people you may have heard of that the Hickmans got out of the country during those first few weeks to safety, especially when all the divines were being rounded up. One of them was a chap called John Fox, who wrote the Book of Martyrs. Have you heard of John Fox?
No, is it the same with John Fox with the Quaker? No.
Now, John Fox, he wrote about all the sufferings, all of everything we know about the executions of Protestants at that time comes from John Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Okay.
The other chap was a close family friend of the Hickmans at Gainsborough, and he was John Knox.
John Knox. Oh, I know.
Can you imagine
we came
the
from
world without John Knox? All of history, that would have really changed things. If you had been forced out of your country as a refugee on the continent, hiding away while England was a Catholic country, you would have had no idea that you would only have to be away from home for 5 years. Nobody knew that Mary wouldn't live that long. She could have lived as long as Elizabeth. But when she died, Elizabeth came onto the throne, and this is when we have problems, because England becomes Protestant again.
Elizabeth is half sister of Mary.
Elizabeth is Henry VIII's daughter, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Mary's half-sister. She comes to the throne.
Okay.
The country is Protestant in name once more, but instead of settling the Church of England as it had been under Edward, when it was almost completely purified, she settled the Church of England to how it was under the reign of Henry VIII in his last years. So, of course, all these Protestants coming back from Europe who'd been in exile were presented with a church which they saw as tainted. They couldn't be a part of Elizabeth's church because it was neither one thing or the other. In fact, John Knox warned some of his followers to have nothing to do with Elizabeth's church. He calls it a meddle, maddle, bastard church because it's neither one thing or the other. He calls it a stinking pile of old works. So all of those reforms gained in Edward's are lost under Elizabeth. Elizabeth knows there are dissenters. Her government knows there are dissenters, and they are given this name that you can spit out like a curse. Puritan.
Puritan.
And that's where the name Puritan comes. Anyone who was harking back to that Reformed church in Edward's time got this name. But the first half of Elizabeth's reign, she has real problems, and that is the Catholics amongst the midst, because this is a Catholic stronghold, especially here in Nottinghamshire, and there are many, many plots against her. So she brings in laws to try to control them. But meanwhile, the Puritan movement is growing, and especially at Cambridge. This is where we have a vast number of Puritan ministers at Cambridge. And this is where Clifton comes in. He's one of those clergy who's trained at Cambridge, have got these strong Puritan ideas, but not only that, he has got a stronger seed, because he is amongst a minority who are now thinking, you know what? This church isn't reforming. We've been trying to purify this church since Henry's reign. Why don't we separate out from it and form our own congregations? This is where the term separatist comes from. And do you know the main problem with that? The head of the church is the monarch. So it's not a case of turning your back on the church in England. It's a case of turning your back on the king or the queen. And that is treason. And this is why it became so dangerous to think of being a separatist. Luckily, throughout Elizabeth's reign, mostly up here where it's quiet in Nottinghamshire, not so easy to do it in London, you could still get a purified service and live peacefully. You could have a purified service that would suit your conscience and not have the authorities interfere with you too much. But that will all change when James comes to the throne. Because once James is on the throne, that's it. Game's going to be over. Now, James. Do you know a lot about King James and the situation?
I think he was James VI from Scotland, and became James I in England.
When Elizabeth died, she didn't have a male heir. Without a male, although we'd had Mary on the throne and Elizabeth, that wasn't the norm, to have women on the throne ruling on their own. That was quite new. But when Elizabeth died without an heir, that caused a real problem, because the next in line of succession, who had a real strong legal claim on the throne of England, was King James.
And James was her cousin, right?
Well, James, it goes back to Henry VIII, because Henry VIII's sister, Margaret, married the King of Scotland, so of course it came through this line. But having said that, Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, had actually made a law that no foreign-born king could sit on the throne of England. So quite secretly, all of these laws had been upturned by Elizabeth and her ministers, and there'd been a lot of negotiation, because it would have shocked the English people to realise we have a Scot on our throne, because for centuries we'd been fighting Scotland.
Right.
So you can imagine, we have a foreign-born king coming onto the throne of England, the king of a country that we've had lots of disputes with. Not only that, well, the Catholics in the country would have been quite excited. Maybe our persecution's going to end, because the Catholics had a dreadful time of persecution. I cannot understate how bad it was to carry on with your Catholic faith. And in fact, it's one of the shames, because it's never mentioned. You don't see it mentioned broadly in history lessons, but the way that the English establishment treated Catholics was absolutely horrendous. But they would have had that glimmer of hope, because James's mother had been Mary, Queen of Scots, and she had been executed, and she was a Catholic martyr. So the hope would have been, this king will have sympathy for us. We can carry on being Catholic. But meanwhile, separatists and Puritans, they would have been happy, because Scotland was a Presbyterian country.
Yeah.
If King James coming down here and said, right, okay, England's going to be Presbyterian now, that would have pleased our folk. That was near enough what they wanted. They could have coped with that quite easily. But, of course, it didn't happen, because James may have had a long plan to turn England back to Catholicism, especially when you look at his dynasty and what happened, because actually when his grandson James II ends up on the throne, he is a Catholic. But if you were coming down from Scotland to take over a throne in England, and the local people are not happy about that anyway, are you on day one going to say, well, actually, I want the country to be Catholic? How long do you think he would have lasted before he was assassinated? Probably about 10 minutes. By that token, if he had wanted to turn the church over to Rome again, perhaps in his son's lifetime, he would not want it to splinter off into little factions. He could never deliver a whole church back to Rome if it had broken off. We have a showdown in 1604. King James calls all his bishops together at the Hampton Court Conference. The question of these dissenters is going to be addressed, because they'd had the audacity, as King James was riding down that Great North Road past this church to London to claim his crown, he was handed a petition by Puritans, and it was called the Millenary Petition. And there were over 1,000 signatures of his most loyal Puritan subjects. And they were the demands that they wanted to see in the church, the reforms. They didn't want the wearing of the fancy garments, the making of the sign of the cross at baptism. They didn't want any of what they perceived to be Catholic hangovers. If it was not in the Bible, it had no place in their church. So at the Hampton Court Conference, this was going to be addressed. You can imagine James with all of his bishops, and invited along was just a handful of the most moderate Puritans. Every time one of those Puritans put the point, sire, we don't want the vestments, up would get all of the bishops and shout them down, and all the reasons why they had to have the vestments. They'd all been primed. They already knew what the questions were going to be. So every time one of these poor Puritans got up, the bishops savaged them like a pack of dogs. And James was not a very nice king. He was very, very volatile, and you can imagine him sitting at the front of that conference, and then at one point losing his temper and saying something like, "Is this all you have to worry about? It's nothing but flea bites." I tell you, I hate Puritans. and dissenters, I will make them conform, or I will harry them out of the land, or I will do worse. Harrying is banishment. What could be worse than banishment? Probably, hanging or chopping your head off. That would have been like a red rag. Can you imagine how our separatists would have felt hearing that? But there's something else that James said that's not widely reported. He was heard to say as he left that conference, the church in Rome, despite her shortcomings, is the mother of the church in England, and I'm prepared to meet her halfway. What did that mean? This is the start of the separation of the separatists, because then there are 140 odd canon laws brought in, because James and his bishops, they all agree, if you get rid of the clergy that have separatist Puritan leanings, if you get rid of them, they are the trouble. The congregations, the ordinary people, are going to conform. Cut the head off, the body dies, yes? They obviously didn't read their Bible. As these laws were brought in, all the clergy had to sign up to them. And at first, more than 300 Puritan clergy said, no, we're not signing up. We're not going to do it. But they started to lose their livings. That was their position in their church. So they would lose not only their congregation, they lost their home, their income, but more importantly, they lost their licence, because only clergy could preach. William Brewster gets into trouble at Scooby. He's called up before the authorities because one Sunday he had been here